Howdy, welcome to the Mays MasterCast. I'm your host, Ben Wiggins, and it is, per usual, a beautiful day in Aggieland. We welcome Dr. Stephen McDaniel, Dr. Mac, to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
No, thanks for having me. This is an honor.
It is our pleasure. 42 years at Texas A&M University. What's kept you here for so long?
Oh, it's got to be the students. I mean, the students are wonderful. I remember one of your previous guests, Will Hayes, talked about moving here from Georgia, and he talked about just how special this place was. He wasn't familiar with Aggieland, and the spirit here and the students, and just how wonderful they are, and that's what I found. I mean, where else do you see 15,000 students come together on a Saturday, in the spring, to give up most of their day to help do chores, for people in the community. And we've done that, with big event. And we've had students that have come over and they pull weeds and planted flowers and trimmed bushes and painted fences and just giving of themselves. I mean, one of A&M's core values is selfless service. And I can just see that in our students. Students here are just different. Last year, one of the big event groups that we had come to our house, we always we meet with them in our garage and we feed them lunch and talk. And I always like to ask them, why'd you come to A&M? And last year I had one that I thought was real interesting. She said, well, I originally intended to go to, and I won't name that other school. It was another large school in Texas.
A different one.
Said, I grew up going there, but I had a friend, who was here, and she kept saying, just come visit. Take one of your campus visits here. No, I'm going to this other place.
Yeah. But
she finally did. So she said she arranged her 2 campus visits to that other school in the morning, and here in the afternoon. And she said, I decided to give them the smile test. Oh. And I'd never heard of the smile test, just to count the number of smiles she got.
Oh, okay.
And so at the other school, she said, nobody smiled at her. Everybody was in there. They had their earpods on and just kind of in their own world and walking around. And she said, I came here and people were saying hi and people were smiling and making eye contact with her and holding the door open for her, asking if they could help her. She said it was just a world of difference. So she said, I decided then I would come here. And that's just kind of how it is here. The students here are different. And so I guess that's the main reason. I love students at A&M, and I just can't imagine teaching anywhere else.
What has it been like mentoring them in student organizations? You served as a faculty advisor to several of those. What are those interactions like? What have you found surprising about that process?
Oh, yeah, I love that. I get to be the faculty advisor to 3 student organizations. Breakaway is a Bible study worship time that meets Tuesday nights in Reed Arena. And so every Tuesday night at 9 o'clock during the fall and spring semester, and have several thousand students, come out for that. Yeah. And we have Breakaway volunteers. So there's about 300 students that apply, and then they go through an interview, and they're accepted as volunteers, and they're placed on 1 or 12 ministry teams. And we'll have one ministry team, for example, is called the Roadies, and so they help set up the stage, and they set up the sound equipment and everything. And sometimes they've got an hour turnaround time between an Aggie basketball game and when Breakaway starts. I'm the faculty advisor for Freedom Ministries from our church, and so getting to interact with those students. And then also there's a student organization called Starlight Aggies, that I get to be their faculty advisor. And that's an organization that, those are students that, they want to help out kids who are sick or those that have disabilities. Like one time, the last meeting, they were making blankets, to give to some special needs kids, and there's a camp called Camp for All, so it ministers to special needs kids.
And the first 2 organizations you mentioned were faith-oriented organizations. What impact does that have on your career, on your work life, on your service life? What does that interaction all look like?
Well, that's kind of who I am. I mean, the turning point in my life, occurred 50 years ago.
Okay.
On May 31st, 1972, when I was a master's student at A&M, and God just kind of put on my heart that I needed to write a letter of apology to a girl I dated in high school who I'd broken up with just kind of suddenly and without talking, and it was very rude. And I'd always kind of felt bad about that. And so I finally wrote her a letter of apology. And that was back when we wrote letters.
Are you sure?
And so she wrote me right back. And she said, Dear Stephen, will I forgive you? May I forgive you? After what Jesus Christ did for me, it would be a privilege to forgive you.
Oh.
And then she told about how she had become a Christian. I knew she had gone to church, and I'd gone to church. But so she talked things that I had never really done. And so then I wrote her and said, well, tell me more. So she wrote me another letter, and she enclosed a little 4 Spiritual Laws booklet from Campus Crusade for Christ. And like the first one in there said, God has a wonderful plan for you. And I really hadn't thought of that before. And then it just went on to say, well, because of what Jesus did, and when I accept him as my personal Lord and Savior and turn my life over to him, well, then God can help me. God can direct me. And so I did that. So May 31st, 1972, I remember kneeling down by my bed and doing that and praying. And then things just changed. Things just, as I look back, there was just a series of events that some people would say, what a coincidence. But it wasn't that. I was a marketing major at A&M. And the reason I was a marketing major is because I wanted to go into retailing. I was going to open up my own retail store one day, and I was going to get trained by JCPenney first so I could know about retailing and go into that. So that was my heart's desire for like 3 or 4 years. And then just out of the blue, right after May 31st, I was a graduate assistant to Dr. Jim McDaniel. He was the head of the marketing department. And he asked me if I wanted to teach a principles of marketing class. That he said he would divide his class in half and let me teach, half of the students. And so, that doesn't happen. We have, in my 42 years at A&M, we've never had a master's student, teach a whole section of principles of marketing.
Right.
But I did that, and I really enjoyed it. And I was working with JCPenney at the time. I was already on their management training program, working in the downtown store in Bryan, and working part-time while I had a graduate assistantship and taking classes.
Right.
But I really enjoyed teaching. And I had a military obligation that was just 3 months because Vietnam had just ended. So I had a 3 months service to my officer's basic course. So I did that in Fort Gordon, Georgia. And then they transferred me to Tyler, Texas, a bigger JCPenney store. And when I was working there, I just kept thinking, I really enjoyed teaching. And that's kind of what I liked even more than what I was doing there. And just coincidentally, you might say, they were opening a new college in Tyler called Tyler State College, which is now UT Tyler, now University of Texas at Tyler.
Yeah.
And I just inquired, do you happen to have a need for somebody that just has a master's degree to teach? And they did. And they wanted somebody that just had a master's degree to teach marketing. And so God opened that door, so I decided, okay, I want to give that a try. Maybe that's what God has for me, instead of retailing, to be in academia. So I wound up teaching there, and God had a reason for me to be in Tyler, because my best friend at JCPenney invited me to go to church with him, and there I met his sister. And his sister, Nancy, and I were married for 41 years. And then also, while I was there, I got to meet the dean of the business school there at Tyler State College. And it just so happens, just again, coincidentally, he happened to be best friends with Dr. Jim McDaniel here, the professor that had me teach the class.
Sure,
so
yeah.
He made a call to Dr. McDaniel, said, "Do you know this guy?" He said, "Yeah, hire him." And so I wound up making that change, then going into academia to try it out. And then another God thing, the other marketing instructor there, she was a professor, had her PhD. She had gone to the University of Arkansas for a PhD, so she kept telling me, "That's where you need to go." And so I applied to Arkansas, and they accepted me, and so went there to get my PhD. So, a lot of people would say a lot of those things were just coincidences. And even then, job opening at A&M. Then in 1980 when I was finishing up and came here, but I just feel that it all goes back to May 31st, 1972, that all those things God just kind of orchestrated to get me where He wanted me to be, to carry out the plan that He had for me.
What do you think Dr. McDaniel would have said about why he asked you to teach that half of that course?
I had substitute taught for him a couple of times. And so and then I was helping him with a book that he was writing at the time, a consumer behavior book. So I think maybe he saw something, there that he thought that I could do a good job in that. And I'd always liked school, and I was always a good student and liked academia. So I think maybe he saw something before I did.
Right. What are your biggest challenges in school and in academia? Like how has that all gone for you? What's been the hardest part? What's been the best part?
I guess the biggest challenge is just time. I know we all probably have that problem, but
right.
I just have trouble. I just run out of hours in the day, and I run out of days in the week. I hear people say TGIF on Fridays, and I never feel that way. I just feel like, I've run out of week. I've got other things I needed to do. As a young professor, there's always a challenge, especially a tenure track professor. That you need to publish or perish, so you need to be focused. And so there's a tendency to kind of maybe do some things that maybe isn't what a university is all about, and that is our students.
Right.
I was fortunate that when I was in the PhD program at Arkansas, there was a paper, the Fayetteville Gazette, I think it was called, and there was a local pastor. He was also the chaplain of the Arkansas Razorbacks. His name was H.D. McCarty.
Okay.
And he wrote a column in the paper every week. And I used to always cut that out, use it in my Sunday school class that I was teaching, and sometimes some of his examples. But there was one that was part of that article that just really stuck in my mind. And I even then typed that out, and I have it on my desk to this day. So I've had that on my desk for over 40 years. And it has to do with that time and how we spend our time. And it says, if I can remember it, it says, when you are tired of interruptions, try to remember that the very purpose of your interruptions indicates the valuableness of your life. Only those who are full of help and support are asked to shoulder other people's problems. The interruptions that we may chafe at are actually the credentials of our indispensability. And then he finishes it by saying, the greatest condemnation anyone could incur is to be so independent, so unhelpful, that nobody ever interrupts us, and we are left comfortably alone.
The echo I hear of that is Jackie Robinson, a life is most important and how it impacts other lives. How do you find, like, if you were to give advice to young academics specifically, because I think time management for an academic, as you alluded to earlier, is very different than it is for an executive, for example. But if you were speaking to young academics and you had, a few sentences to say to them about time management, specifically early in a research career, what would you say?
Well, you said that it was probably different for a young academician than it is for a business executive, but I'd say no, it's similar.
Is it?
Because I mean, business executives, they're focused on the results and doing what they're supposed to be doing, their job, and what they're called upon to be doing, and so an academic, they're kind of the same way. They're focused on what they're supposed to be doing. But I just think, but the bottom line is people. It's not really what you're doing. Say you're writing and your research or whatever, but it's with flesh and blood. When they're right there with you and they need some help, or they want you to spend some time with them. I think that's most important. People are more important. I know. I remember in my teaching, for example, I remember hearing one time early in my career, it said, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so even being a successful professor, I think with our students, because that's our main responsibility, I think, is the students that are right there in front of us. And I found early on, but my first year here did not go well because I really didn't know my students, had big classes. And one of the other professors who came in at the same time I did, and then he wound up leaving after a few years to take a department headship somewhere else. But he said, what I found that I really enjoy doing is going out to eat with my students. So I started doing that. And so I'd pass around sign-up sheet, sign up 3 or 4 at a time. We'll go to a restaurant, wherever you want to go. I'm not paying for it. I mean, you're paying for yours, I'll pay for mine. But I'd invite my wife to come. Sometimes my kids, would come too. And then, but I just get to spend an hour or so just talking with them and just finding out what are their goals, what are they trying to do, and then can I help them? And even now, I get to also teach in our Freshman Business Initiative program, FBI. So I've been teaching master students for 21 years, but now I've got first semester freshmen.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful. And so I get these first semester freshmen, but I make sure that I have one-on-one interview times with each one of them, just so I can get to know them, just so I can help them, just so I can answer their questions, and just so they know that I care. So I would say advice to a young academician that, you've got your students here, and that's really what a university is all about. I think that's our first mission, really, is the students that are right there.
Yeah. Shouts from me to Dr. Kurokre, who took us out to lunch. I think our whole MBA class, he took us out group by group, and that's
same thing.
That's the first time I'd seen anyone do that.
And you remember him doing that?
Sure do.
And I'm always impressed that even 20 years later, some of my students I'll run across and they'll come back. They can remember where we went to eat. So they remember that.
How else do you connect with students after graduation? Like, what do those interactions look like? I know my dad, who taught here, Steve Wiggins, taught at the university for a long time, and he would always, one of his best moments in any week or any month was hearing from a past student. What do those interactions look like for you?
I probably spend at least an hour, sometimes 2 hours every day emailing, with some of my students.
Okay.
That they've emailed me or something. I started many years ago, and I wish I would have started sooner, but probably 15 years ago. I started making note of when their birthday was. So I've got a birthday list of my former. So every day I've got maybe 2, 3, 4 happy birthday emails that I'm sending out.
Yeah.
But I kind of update them on some things that are going on with A&M or with me or study abroad, or I'll mention something about them or something that I really appreciate about them. I'll look up where, just to make sure I know where they're working. So I'll even look up on Facebook sometime just to make sure I know how many kids they've got now. So I'll say something. So I'll send, and just the number of emails I get back. In fact, I got one back just this weekend, from one of my students, and she just said, for 10 years, I've looked forward to your email probably more than any others, that you're just so thoughtful in keeping up with me and remembering my birthday. So that's one thing that I do. I get, and, I reach out to them, but they also do stuff for me too. Like I have, and in fact, I wish we had a picture of it. I have a big Coke collection, in my office. I have probably 500 Cokes.
Oh.
That all started back in 1989 when my wife and I took a tour of Egypt and Jordan and Israel. And I bought a Coke in Israel that I thought was cool. It had Hebrew writing on it. And so I brought it back in my suitcase and I put it on my shelf. And Blake has seen my office, so he's seen my Coke collection. But it's grown from that one, and I never intended to collect Coke. But I have about 500 Cokes and Coke memorabilia now. Like last spring, I had one of my former master's students who called me and said, Dr. Mack, we're getting ready to move, and I've got some Cokes, from a little collection I have. Do you want them? So I met her halfway between here and Houston, her and her family, and she gave me a bunch. So I created a whole shelf. So I've got 2 full bookcases, in my office now that are just Coke things. But what I most like about it is that virtually every one of those has been given to me by a student or a former student. Mm-hmm. And I've got them from all over the world. I've got them from Italy, and I've got them from Germany and Austria. And in fact, some of them that I've got from Germany. I've got one of my former students. She's coming in. Whoops, I just hit the mic. She's coming in from Germany to see an Aggie football game. Oh. She's German. But she just fell in love with A&M. She follows football recruiting. She's German.
Yeah.
In fact,
this is a good time to be following A&M football recruiting in her defense.
But she's coming in, and so she's given me several of those Cokes. But I guess just to tell you a funny story, I had one of my master's students who was from Turkey, and as he was getting ready to graduate, he said, Dr. Matt, do you have a Coke from Turkey? And I said, no, I don't. And he said, well, when I get back, I'm going to send you one.
Okay.
And so I said, no, you don't have to do that. That's a lot of trouble. He said, no, I insist. I'm going to. And I said, well, I tell you, let me give you a $10 bill to at least cover postage. And he didn't want to take it, but I insisted. So he took the $10 bill.
Yeah.
Well, fast forward 2 years later, there was another student from Turkey. Wasn't one of my students, but she was interested in our MS marketing program, so I was talking to her about it.
Right.
And then she was admiring my Coke collection, and she said, do you have one from Turkey? And I said, well, no, but I'm supposed to, because I had a student from Turkey 2 years ago, and he was going to send me one, and I even gave him money for postage, but he hadn't done it. And it's amazing. But at that moment, I had a knock on the door, and it was that first student.
Oh.
And he was standing there with a can of Coke in his hand. His sister was graduating, so he had come back for his sister's graduation. And I mean, what are the odds? I mean, this girl here was from Turkey.
Sure,
they weren't related, and then here he was. So to me, it was just sort of a God thing. Like I said a while ago, I don't believe in coincidences. I think God works things out. And even with that, I think of just teaching me to not give up on people, to trust people, that when they say they're going to do something, okay, I'm going to trust that they're going to.
Sure. That's pretty incredible. Let's see. There's so many places we could go here. Oh, how does your faith play into your interaction with students? What do you have to check yourself on, if anything?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, my first identity is as a follower of Christ. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's who I am.
Yeah. And
I tell my students the first day of class that I'm a Christian.
Right.
And I tell them I'm a deacon at our church, and I sing in the choir, and I teach a Sunday school class there. So I want them to know where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
But I don't proselytize. I mean, if students ask me questions, like I've had students that have asked me in class, Dr. Mack, why are you so happy?
That's a good one.
I'll give them an answer. But yeah, I realize I've got, different beliefs, and I've got, so yeah, I think through the years, I think God has given me wisdom, on that as to how I do. I have some materials in my office. I've got The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel on my book.
Sure.
And I've got Purpose-Driven Life, part of that, that will help students. And I've got some other things. And I don't offer them to the students, but if they want one, I give it to them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so those are available. But I think just in terms of how I teach, and I think just like I've talked about, I care about my students, and I want them to be successful. And I think who I am, manifests itself in some things that I teach. For example, for several years I've taught, there's a book called A Complaint-Free World. And it's by, the author is Will Bowen. And the purpose of his book, he says that there's too much complaining in this world. There's too much negativity. And so that's one of the books that I've had my students read. And we talk about it for a couple of days in class. And he challenges in his book, he challenges people to go 21 days without complaining, without saying anything negative, without whining or griping or gossiping or any negativity. And he gives out these little purple bracelets. And if you catch yourself saying anything negative, you've got to move from one hand to the other.
Okay. And
I give those out to my students. And so I say, you don't have to use a purple bracelet. I've got another one here that I use.
Yeah.
Or you can use a coin in your pocket or something. But I tell them, if you can go not 21 days, that's hard. It takes between 6 and 8 months for the average person that's trying this to do that. If you can go 7 days, I'll give you a gift card to your favorite restaurant. And so through the years, I've given out, not very many of them, but I've given out some. Students that have been able to go 7 days, and then those that have gone 7 days, a lot of times they do 21 days. But it also, there's a verse in the Bible, Ephesians 4:29, that says, "Let no unwholesome word proceed out of your mouth, but only what's good for building others up."
Yeah.
So really, anything we say should be something that's positive, something that's good for building others up. And I share with my students this one meta-analysis of 500 studies that have shown a strong relationship between positivity and success. Positive people tend to be more successful in life.
Yeah.
And that's been empirically shown.
Yeah.
Positive people tend to be happier. They tend to have better relationships. They tend to have better marriages and better families. They tend to be healthier. Positive people tend to be healthier than those that are depressed and whining and moaning and groaning. Right. And also, and I found this astounding, positive people even tend to live longer. Statistically, they have a longer longevity than negative people.
Right. Okay.
So there's a lot of benefits in positivity. So I try to get that across to my students also.
I imagine they find a ton of value in that. What would you then say, though, to someone who is struggling with depression, for example? Like how do you reconcile that with somebody who's at a very difficult place in their life, or who's just come out of a situation of abuse? Like how does that all coalesce? That's
a really good question, because that also has to be dealt with, and Will Bowen addresses that in his book as well. But first of all, we need to kind of train ourselves that if we have a problem, that we need to take it to the person that can do something about it. So if we have a problem with another person, that we shouldn't be talking to somebody else and whining, complaining, moaning. we need to try to work that out with that person.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, I think that helps a lot. Like in marital situations or whatever it might be, talk it out.
Mm-hmm.
And not complain to your friend, about all this. But
Right.
but there are some medical cases of people that do need some medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that happens, then they need to have treatments for that.
Mm-hmm.
But people who have been hurt, like you said, abused, they need some help, and they need to talk that out with someone,
Mm-hmm.
and they need to be able to even be able to see the good that can come out of that. Just to give an example, I've got someone very close to me, whose spouse left him for somebody else, and yet left him with 3 kids. But that person now can see even that God has used that, and God has blessed them even with that. So instead of wallowing in despair and depression, they've been able to look at the good side of that and realize there's been some good that has come out of that.
I want to touch on something. I've been trying to find a way to this, and I haven't been able to figure out how to do it yet. But let's talk about studying abroad for a few minutes. What has your experience been like with and around that?
Well, that's something that I love. For 16 years, I've gotten to take normally 80 students to Europe, and it's the longest running and the largest study abroad at A&M. We've been doing it in our department for 42 years. COVID, for 2 years, we had to do it virtually.
Mm-hmm.
But usually we take 80 students, and we go to 7 countries. And for 4 weeks, a 4-week study abroad, 7 countries. I jokingly refer to it as the study abroad for the ADD student. That we're here for a while, and then we go here, and then we go here, then we go here, then we go here, and we line up like 15 businesses to do. And I've just seen such a transformation in students. That so many of the students, they've never been out of Texas, or maybe at least most of them haven't been out of the U.S. And now they're in 7 different cultures, and they're learning to speak Italian and French and German, and we help them out with that and have some language cards for them. And they have to interview somebody and to try to get to know somebody in each one of these countries that we visit. Mm-hmm. And I've had, in fact, even one of our former deans at Mays Business School, his daughter went on our trip a few years ago. And after we got back, he said, she grew up on that trip because she just got these experiences that she wouldn't have gotten, and she just got a lot more confidence in herself, too. And students get jobs from this. I had a couple of years ago, I was walking in the hall of Mays and had I hear, Dr. Mack. And so the guy comes running down the hall. He's one of my former study abroaders, and he gives me a hug and say, well, what's going on? He was speaking to a finance course. He was guest speaking here. And he said, I just love the work that I'm doing. He said, but let me tell you, I wouldn't have gotten this job if it hadn't been for that study abroad. Because they were so impressed that I had gone to all these European countries, and in my job I have to do some traveling, and so I wouldn't have gotten this job if it hadn't been. And I hear that a lot. I've heard that a lot of times. Students say that in the job interview, that's all they want to talk about. Is this 7-country trip that you took? Tell me about it. Mm-hmm. And so, I love getting to know the students, and I get to spend a month, with these students, and getting to go to eat with them, and getting to hang out with them, and it keeps me young. It really keeps me young.
I believe you. What's next for you?
Well, I think I want to continue doing that. I don't have an end game for that. I love taking the students abroad, so I love doing that. I love teaching these first semester freshmen, and just the energy and the enthusiasm that they have, that maybe I can help them out and kind of help them to be academically successful, while they're here at A&M. and serving these student organizations. I just love being a part of those. So I really, it's just kind of, I want to keep on keeping on. So that's really my plan, is just to keep doing what I'm doing now.
Beautiful. Any good bull?
Oh, good bull. So who would I like to thank? I think a couple of groups. First of all, we have an MS Marketing Advisory Board. It's our MS Master of Science in Marketing. We have an advisory board that I put together several years ago.
Yeah.
And still have that. Well, a few months ago, they honored me by establishing a scholarship in my name. So it's a Stephen W. McDaniel Marketing Study Abroad Scholarship. And so now it's funded, it's fully funded. But I would encourage anybody that might like to help a future student do a study abroad to look up that and maybe make a donation to that fund. So it was that advisory board that did that. So that's one shout out or good bull that I like to give. Another one is to my MS in Marketing class of 2017.
Okay.
My wife passed away January 18th, 2017. And we had been married 41 years. I don't know if I can say this, but about a month after God called her home, after my class one day, in fact, it was a meeting we had with an advisory board in my class. We had a luncheon, so I was dismissing everybody.
Yeah.
And one of the students, stood up, and she said, well, Dr. Mack, there's something that we need to tell you. And she said, in about a month, if you look out your window, there'll be a tree, a bench, and a plaque. And the plaque will say, in memory of Nancy Mama Mack McDaniel. Mm-hmm. Said, because we know you loved her a lot. And a lot of our students got to know her too, because she went on a study abroad trip and just loved the students, and they loved hanging out with her. Mm-hmm. And they even went to the extent of having A&M line up that tree so I could see it from my office. So it's perfectly lined up. So whenever I stand up from my desk, I look out. It's on the other side of the pavilion outside of Wayner, outside of the lobby, and you go out there, and there's a pavilion on the other side of that. There's this tree, a bench, and a plaque. And so those students did that. And they were running a little bit short of money for the bench, so they asked some of the advisory board members, and so a couple of the advisory board members then also chipped in and helped out with that too. Mm-hmm. But I was sobbing, when they told me that, and I finally blubbered out that that I don't think anybody has ever done anything nicer for my wife and me than that. And every January the 18th, which is her homegoing, mm-hmm. and every October the 4th, which is her birthday, my daughter and her 3 girls bring up flowers, and we put underneath the tree there and just kind of remember my wife.
Thanks for sharing that. And thanks for your time.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a joy.